Good evening and welcome to another edition of What Do You Think? My name is Bill Morse and I will be hosting this program. Today is the 5th of May, Thursday. So feliz Cinco de Mayo a todos los colegas aquí en Bellows Falls y los alrededores. Feliz Día de Mayo. It's more of a holiday, I think, in schools. Schools like to use Cinco de Mayo as a theme celebration for Mexico, and so I just wanted to mention it. Also, as a lover of Mexican music and Mexican cuisine, just hats off to the people, el pueblo de México y sus costumbres. Anyway, we have been reading. This will be the third session. George Orwell's book, 1984, was written in the late 40s by George Orwell after the close of World War II, after the defeat of one totalitarian government, that is the defeat of Nazi Germany, and by another totalitarian government, Stalin's Communist Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, and by our own government, as well as others that are democratically or republics in their own right. So the reason we've been reading 1984 is I believe there are quite a few parallels between what George Orwell envisioned as a possibility for the world's future, a world's future under two or three world governments that in this book are constantly at war with each other. They just trade hats, so to speak. Kind of like the three superpowers that we have today, China, the United States, and to a lesser degree, Russia. And this is the culmination, I believe, of what was called the Cold War. And even though we are no longer threatening each other with military-type destruction through bombs and weapons of mass destruction, there is friction, there is a lot of undercurrent, and with technology, the development of technology through the media, through what we see and what we hear, artificial intelligence, computer-generated imagery, and the fact that our media is controlled by 6 or 7 huge corporations that shape the narration of what we hear, we are in many respects already in this fictitious world of 1984. Just a few examples off the top of my head. We have a conflict there is a conflict in the Ukraine after the Russian invasion. And it's kind of a hangover from the peace dividend, so to speak, in 1991 when the Soviet Union was broken up into its original republics, the Ukraine being one of them. Whereby the USSR, the Warsaw Pact forces were broken up. NATO forces were never broken up, and NATO advanced more further to the east towards Russia, and now is in Poland and in the Baltic states, areas that were once protected by the Soviet Warsaw Pact, and now now there are NATO weapons being delivered to Ukrainian forces in an effort to push the Russians out of the Ukraine. And in covering that conflict, and it is a war, there are people definitely suffering. There is a lot of damage going on to military and civilian targets like hospitals, etc., infrastructure. We've been seeing a lot of computer-generated imagery that has been passed off as actual war footage, as well as doctored imagery from other places in the world, the Middle East, for example, and actual falsified video and audio from these places, so that you wind up really not knowing what the hell is going on unless you are actually there. And even if you are there, it's hard to follow what's going on because some of us have heard it's hard to tell the good guys from the bad guys. The uniforms change, and the tactics are just as bad one side or the other insofar as the harm done on the civilian population. So that's kind of like that's an example, I believe, of something that is not really what it appears to be, and to really. And this is not something most people are able to do. They have the time, the energy, or the wherewithal is to actually find out who is giving you this news and what is their purpose. What are they trying to sell as far as a reason for us to get further involved? And we just got out of 20 years of being in Afghanistan with nothing to show other than amputees, death, and wounded GIs coming back, and who knows how many Afghani civilians and military that were also harmed in those 20 years with nothing to show. So that theme of going from one war to another to keep people distracted, to keep people emotionally charged, to keep the arms dealers flush with government funding, the military-industrial complex. That theme is brought up in this book as the three nations kind of pick wars with each other over trumped up, pardon the pun, trumped up reasons that are false. We've done that before. The reason we were in Vietnam was from a fake attack that happened in a bay along the coast of I believe, South Vietnam, in which our Navy was attacked, and President Johnson used that as a reason to escalate the war. So it's hard for it's hard for people like ourselves who are not in the military or who are not in high-level government positions to know exactly what's going on. Another example, and then we'll get back to the book, Winston Smith, is the current controversy over the Supreme Court. Now, the news, the mainstream media leaked out the news that the Supreme Court had conferred and was heading towards a verdict or a finding on Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade was a Supreme Court decision made in 1973 in which the end result was the person's right to, a woman's right to an abortion. And since then, there's been a tug of war back and forth between people who see this as a right and those who see this as a form of infanticide, depending often on the time of the abortion during the 9-month pregnancy period. The other story, there's a parallel story going on, and that is that the Supreme Court is not looking at the abortion question, Roe versus Wade, but instead is going to be looking at allegations or evidence that show election fraud during the 2020 presidential election, and that they have evidence before them that they are considering, which shows fraud, widespread fraud, voter fraud, in several states that were key in turning the election in President Joe Biden's favor. So the parallel story is that they are investigating the evidence that they have before them of fraudulent vote counting, and that they are ready to release a verdict of that will overthrow the election results from the November 2020 presidential election. Now, is that true or not? I don't know. It's just a parallel story that reinforces the belief that the Roe versus Wade controversy or the Roe versus Wade story is just a distraction from the real story, that being a verdict on overturning the election results due to fraudulent vote counting in the 2020 election. So I don't know if either story is true. You will find video footage to support one and not the other. But one or the other, either one or the other is true, or neither story is true, and we are just being fed, once again, a continual diet of fake stories as a distraction from what is really happening. And that's pretty much how Oceania, which is one of the three countries in 1984, operates. It goes from one catastrophe, false or fake narrative to another to keep people unsettled, to keep people constantly in fear, to keep people off balance and ready for any lifeline from the government that offers security and explanation, and it makes people very vulnerable. So we've had a rough 2 years of very often false narratives that have fed on people's fear. And I don't think we're out of the woods yet. In fact, I think we have to go through a certain cycle of false stories before we're paying close enough attention to what is happening and looking beyond what we're being told, look beyond what we are being fed on a daily basis. So we're going to continue reading for about 15 minutes the next section of George Orwell's 1984. And we're going into the 2-minute hate session at work in the Ministry of Truth. Now, interesting choice of words, Ministry of Truth, where Winston works. Winston is the main protagonist, the main character in this story of 1984. Winston stopped writing. He's writing a diary, partly because he was suffering from a cramp. In 1984, everybody, as today, they work from a laptop. They have their version of the internet or television, which is telespeech, I believe. I forget what it's called. Anyway, it looks at you and it listens to you and you can interact with it, kind of like Alexa. All right? But the curious thing that while he was doing so, a totally different memory had crafted itself in his mind to the point where he almost felt equal to writing it down. Writing down was coming to his head in the form of a diary. It was, he now realized, because of this other incident that he had suddenly decided to come home and begin the diary today. It happened that morning at the ministry, if anything so nebulous could be said to happen. It was nearly 1100, military time 11 o'clock, and in the records department where Winston worked, they were dragging the chairs out of the cubicles and grouping them in the center of the hall, opposite the big telescreen, in preparation for the 2-minute hate. Winston was just taking his place in one of the middle rows when two people who he knew by sight but had never spoken to came unexpectedly into the room. One of them was a girl whom he had often passed in the corridors. He did not know her name, but he knew that she worked in the fiction department. Presumably, since he had always seen her with oily hands and carrying a spanner. A spanner is the British term for a wrench. She had some mechanical job on one of the novel writing machines. She was a bold-looking girl of about 27 with thick dark hair, a freckled face, and swift athletic movements. A narrow scarlet sash, emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League, was wound several times around the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the shapeliness of her hips. Winston had disliked her from the very first moment of seeing her. He knew the reason. It was because of the atmosphere of hockey fields and cold baths and community hikes and general clean-mindedness, which she married, Freudian slip, which she managed to carry about with her. He disliked nearly all women, especially the young and pretty ones. It was always the women, and above all the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents to the party, the swallowers of the slogans, the amateur spies, and nosers out of unorthodoxy. But this particular girl gave him the impression of being more dangerous than most. Once when they passed in the corridor, she had given him a quick sidelong glance which seemed to pierce right into him and for a moment had filled him with black terror. The idea had then crossed his mind that she might be an agent of the thought police. That is, if it was true, was very unlikely. Still, he continued to feel a particular uneasiness, which had fear mixed up in it as well as hostility, and whenever she was anywhere near him. The other person was a man named O'Brien, a member of the inner party and holder of some post so important and remote that Winston had only a dim idea of its nature. A momentary hush passed over the group of people around the chairs as they saw the black overalls of an inner party member approaching. O'Brien was a large, burly man with thick neck and coarse, humorous, brutal face. In spite of his formidable appearance, he had a certain charm of manner. He had a trick of resettling his spectacles on his nose, which was curiously disarming. In some indefinable way, curiously civilized. It was a gesture which, if anyone had still thought in such terms, might have been called an 18th century nobleman offering his snuff box. Winston had seen O'Brien perhaps a dozen times in almost as many years. He felt deeply drawn to him, and not solely because he was intrigued by the contrast between O'Brien's urbane manner and his prizefighter's physique, much more because of a secretly held belief, or perhaps not even belief, merely a hope, that O'Brien's political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something in his face suggested it irresistibly. And again, because it was not even unorthodoxy that was written in his face, but simply intelligence. But at any rate, he had the appearance of a person you could get to talk to if someone could cheat the telescreen and get him alone. Winston had never made the smallest effort to verify his guess. Indeed, there was no way of doing so. At this moment, O'Brien glanced at his wristwatch, saw that it was nearly 1100, and evidently decided to stay in the records department until the 2 minutes' hate was over. He took a chair in the same row as Winston, a couple of places away. A small, sandy-haired woman who worked in the next cubicle to Winston was between them. The girl with dark hair was sitting immediately behind. The next moment, a hideous, grinding speech, as of some monstrous machine running without oil, burst from the big telescreen at the end of the room. It was a noise that set one's teeth on edge and bristled the hair at the back of one's neck. The hate had started. As usual, the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, had flashed onto the screen. There were hisses here and there among the audience. The little sandy-haired woman gave a squeak of mingled fear and disgust. Goldstein was the renegade and backslider who once, long ago, had been one of the leading figures of the party, almost on level with Big Brother himself, and then had engaged in counter-revolutionary activities, had been condemned to death, and had mysteriously escaped and disappeared. The program of the 2 Minutes Hate varied from day to day, but there was none in which Goldstein was not the principal figure. He was the primal traitor, the earliest defiler of the party's purity. All subsequent crimes against the party, all treacheries, acts of sabotage, heresies, deviations, sprang directly out of his teaching. Somewhere or other he was still alive and hatching his conspiracies. Perhaps somewhere beyond the sea, under the protection of his foreign paymasters, perhaps even, so it was occasionally rumored, in some hiding place in Oceania itself. Winston's diaphragm was constricted. He could never see the face of Goldstein without a painful mixture of emotions. It was a lean Jewish face, with a great fuzzy aureole of white hair and a small goatee beard. A clever face, and yet somehow inherently despicable, with a kind of senile silliness in the long, thin nose, near the end of which a pair of spectacles were perched. It resembled the face of a sheep, and the voice, too, had a sheep-like quality. Goldstein was delivering his usual venomous attack upon the doctrines of the party, an attack so exaggerated and perverse that a child should have been able to see through it, and yet just plausible enough to fill one with an alarmed feeling that other people, less level-headed than oneself, might be taken in by it. He was abusing Big Brother. He was denouncing the dictatorship of the party. He was demanding the immediate conclusion of peace with Eurasia. He was advocating freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. He was crying hysterically that the revolution had been betrayed. And all this in rabid polysyllabic speech, which was a sort of parody of the habitual style of the orators of the party, and even contained newspeak words. More newspeak words, indeed, than any party member would normally use in real life. And all the while, lest one should be in any doubt as to the reality which Goldstein's specious claptrap covered, behind his head on the telescreen there marched the endless columns of the Eurasian army, row after row of solid-looking men with expressionless Asiatic faces, who swarm up to the surface of the screen and vanished, to be replaced by others exactly similar. The dull rhythmic tramp of the soldiers' boots formed the background to Goldstein's bleeding voice. Before the hate had proceeded for 30 seconds, uncontrollable exclamations of rage were breaking out from half the people in the room. The self-satisfied sheep-like face on the screen and the terrifying power of the Eurasian army behind it were too much to be borne. Besides, the sight or even the thought of Goldstein produced fear and anger automatically. He was an object of hatred more constant than either Eurasia or Eastasia, since when Oceania was at war with one of these powers, it was generally at peace with the other. But what was strange was that although Goldstein was hated and despised by everybody, although every day and 1,000 times a day, on platforms, on the telescreen, in newspapers, in books, his theories were refuted, smashed, ridiculed, held up to the general gaze for the pitiful rubbish that they were. In spite of all this, his influence never seemed to grow less. Always there were fresh dupes waiting to be seduced by him. A day never passed when spies and saboteurs acting under his direction were not unmasked by the thought police. He was the commander of a vast, shadowy army, an underground network of conspirators dedicated to the overthrow of the state. The Brotherhood, its name was supposed to be. That is Goldstein's group. There were also whispered stories of a terrible book, a compendium of all the heresies, of which Goldstein was the author and which circulated clandestinely here and there. It was a book without a title. People referred to it, if at all, simply as the book. But no one knew of such things only through vague rumors. Kind of like the rumors I was just talking to you about regarding Supreme Court activity. Neither the Brotherhood nor the book was a subject that any party member would mention if there was a way of avoiding it. In its second minute, the hate rose to a frenzy. People were leaping up and down in their places, shouting at the tops of their voices in an effort to drown the maddening, bleating voice that came from the screen. The little sandy-haired woman had turned bright pink, and her mouth was opening and shutting like one of a landed fish. Even O'Brien's heavy face was flushed. He was sitting very straight in his chair, his powerful chest swelling and quivering as though he were standing up to the assault of a wave. The dark-haired girl behind Winston had begun crying out, "Swine! Swine! Swine!" And suddenly she picked up a heavy Newspeak dictionary and flung it at the screen. It struck Goldstein's nose and bounced off, and the voice continued to speak. In a lucid moment, Winston found that he was shouting with the others and kicking his heel violently against the rung of his chair. The horrible thing about the 2 minutes' hate was not that one was obliged to act the part, but that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces with a sledgehammer, seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one, even against one's will, into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was an abstract, undirected emotion, which could be switched from one object to another like the flame of a blow lamp. Thus, at one moment, Winston's hatred was not turned against Goldstein at all, but on the contrary, against Big Brother, the party, the thought police, and at such moments his heart went out to the lonely, derided heretic on the screen, sole guardian of truth and sanity in a world of lies. And yet the very next instant he was at one with the people about him, and all that was said of Goldstein seemed to him to be true. At those moments his secret loathing of Big Brother changed into adoration, and Big Brother seemed to tower up, an invincible, fearless protector, standing like a rock against the hordes of Asia, And Goldstein, in spite of his isolation, his helplessness, and the doubt that hung about his very existence, seemed like some sinister enchanter, capable by the mere power of his voice of wrecking the structure of civilization. So we're going to take just a short break to drink some water. I just find that last paragraph enlightening as to the psychology of human nature, of human emotion. When it gets ratcheted up at a feverish pitch, how easy it is to direct the anger, the emotion, or the fear from one object to another. It's a good portrayal. It's sobering, but I think it's a somewhat accurate portrayal of how easy it is to manipulate emotion on a large scale. Oliver, this is Oliver, by the way. Have some water. No? I'm going to have some water, but it'll have quinine in it. Tonic water with quinine. It's good for cramps. All right, so okay, we're going to sit back here, and we're just going to continue another 5 minutes, okay? I want to hear what happened to the rest of the 2-minute hate. I'm sure something else happened. Let's find out. Oh, you spilled some water. Oh, well. It's hot outside, so what we can do. There. Okay, so it was even possible at moments to switch one's hatred this way or that by a voluntary act. Suddenly, by the sort of violent effort with which one wrenches one's head away from the pillow in a nightmare, Winston succeeded in transferring his hatred from the face on the screen to the dark-haired girl behind him. Vivid, beautiful hallucinations flashed through his mind. He would hit her repeatedly with a rubber truncheon. He would tie her to a stake and shoot her full of arrows like Saint Sebastian. He would put her to death. Better than before, however, he would realize why it was that he hated her. He hated her because she was young and pretty and sexless, because he wanted to be with her and would never be able to do so, because round her sweet waist, which seemed to ask you to encircle it with your arm, was only the odious scarlet sash, aggressive symbol of chastity. The hate rose to its climax. The voice of Goldstein had become an actual sheep's bleat, and for an instant the face changed into that of a sheep. Then the sheep face melted into the figure of a Eurasian soldier who seemed to be advancing, huge and terrible, his machine gun roaring and seeming to spring out of the surface of the screen, so that some of the people in the front row actually flinched backwards in their seats. But at the same moment, drawing a deep sigh of relief from everybody, the hostile figure melted into the face of Big Brother. Black-haired, black-mustached, full of power and mysterious calm, and so vast that he filled up the screen. Nobody heard what Big Brother was saying. It was merely a few words of encouragement, the sort of words that are uttered in the din of battle, not distinguishable individually, but restoring confidence by the fact of merely being spoken. Then the face of Big Brother faded away, and instead the three slogans of the party stood out in bold capitals. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. That sounds like, but the face of Big Brother seemed to persist for several seconds on the screen, as though the impact that it had made on everybody's eyeballs was too vivid to wear off immediately. The little sandy-haired woman had flung herself over the back of the chair in front of her, wow, I don't know how to say that word, Oliver. With a murmur that sounded like "my savior," she extended her arms upward toward the screen. Then she buried her face in her hands. It was apparent that she was uttering a prayer. At this moment, the entire group of people broke into a deep, slow, rhythmical chant of "BB, BB, BB," over and over again, very slowly, with a long pause between the first B and the second. B, B. A heavy, murmurous sound, somehow curiously savage, in the background of which one seemed to hear the stamp of naked feet and the throbbing of tom-toms. For perhaps as much as 30 seconds, they kept it up. It was a refrain that was often heard in moments of overwhelming emotion. Partly it was a sort of hymn to the wisdom and majesty of Big Brother, but still more it was an act of self-hypnosis, a deliberate drowning of consciousness by means of rhythmic noise. Winston's guts seemed to be growing cold. In the 2 minutes' hate, he could not help sharing in the general delirium. But this subhuman chanting of B, 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 always filled him with horror. Of course he chanted with the rest. It was impossible to do otherwise. To dissemble your feelings, to control your face, to do what everybody else was doing, was an instinctive reaction. But there was a space of a couple of seconds during which the expression in his eyes might conceivably have betrayed him. And it was exactly at that moment that the significant thing happened, if indeed it did happen. Momentarily, he caught O'Brien's eye. O'Brien had stood up. He had taken off his spectacles and was in the act of resettling them on his nose with his characteristic gesture. But there was a fraction of a second when their eyes met, and for as long as it took to happen, Winston knew, yes, he knew, that O'Brien was thinking the same thing as himself. An unmistakable message had passed. It was though their two minds had opened and thoughts were flowing from one into the other through their eyes. "I am with you," O'Brien seemed to be saying. "I know precisely what you are feeling. I know all about your contempt, your hatred, your disgust. But don't worry, I am on your side." And then the flash of intelligence was gone, and O'Brien's face was as inscrutable as everybody else's. That was all, and he was already uncertain whether it had happened. Such incidents never had any sequel. All they did was to keep alive in him the belief, the hope that others beside himself were the enemies of the party. Perhaps the rumors of vast underground conspiracies were true after all. Perhaps the Brotherhood really existed. It was impossible, in spite of the endless arrests and confessions and executions, to be sure that the Brotherhood was not simply a myth. Some days he believed in it, some days not. There was no evidence, only fleeting glimpses that might mean anything or nothing. Snatches of overheard conversation, faint scribbles on lavatory walls. Once even, when two strangers met, a small movement of the hands which had looked as though it might be a signal of recognition. It was all guesswork. Very likely he had imagined everything. He had gone back to his cubicle without looking at O'Brien again. The idea of following up their momentary contact hardly crossed his mind. It would have been inconceivably dangerous even if he had known how to set about doing it. For a second, 2 seconds, they had exchanged an equivocal glance, and that was the end of the story. But even that was a memorable event in the locked loneliness in which one had to live. Winston roused himself and sat up straighter. He let out a belch. The victory gin he was drinking rose from his stomach. His eyes refocused on the page. This is the page of his diary. His eyes refocused on the page. He discovered that while he sat helplessly musing, he had been writing, as though by automatic action. And it was no longer the same cramped, awkward handwriting as before. His pen had slid voluptuously over the smooth paper, printing in large, neat capitals, "Down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother," over and over again, filling half the page. He could not help feeling a twinge of panic. It was absurd, since the writing of those particular words were not more dangerous than the initial act of opening the diary. But for a moment he was tempted to tear out the spoiled pages and abandon the enterprise of writing a diary altogether. He did not do so, however, because he knew that it was useless. Whether he wrote "Down with Big Brother" or whether he refrained from writing it made no difference. Whether he went on with the diary or whether he did not go on with it made no difference. The thought police would get him just the same. He had committed, would still have committed, even if he had never set pen to paper, the essential crime that contained all others in itself. Thought crime, they called it. Thought crime was not a thing that could be concealed forever. You might dodge successfully for a while, even for years, but sooner or later it was bound to get you. It was always at night. The arrests invariably happened at night. The sudden jerk out of sleep, the rough hand shaking your shoulder, the lights glaring in your eyes, the ring of hard faces around your bed. In the vast majority of cases, there was no trial, no report of the arrest. People simply disappeared, always during the night. Your name was removed from the registers. Every record of everything you had ever done was wiped out. Your one-time existence was denied and then forgotten. You were abolished, annihilated, canceled. Vaporized was the usual word the party used. For a moment he was seized by a kind of hysteria. He began writing in a hurriedly untidy scrawl. "They'll shoot me. I don't care. They'll shoot me in the back of the neck. I don't care. Down with Big Brother. They always shoot you in the back of the neck. I don't care. Down with Big Brother." He sat back in his chair, slightly ashamed of himself, and laid down the pen. The next moment he started violently. There was a knocking at the door. And so we will stop there and continue next Thursday at 5:45 with a continuation of comment and reading from George Orwell's 1984. Until then, enjoy the nice weather. Have a good weekend. And Oliver and I say so long and God bless. Bye-bye.